No, now we're no. Hi, everybody. Hi. It is a sunny Wednesday afternoon here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Thanks for being here in person or online. I'm Kareem Bardisi. I'm the Executive Director of the DAIS, a public policy and leadership think tank here at Toronto Metropolitan University. We're thrilled you're joining us for the latest TMU Democracy Forum on suing social media. I see some new faces, some familiar faces, some student faces, and we're joined virtually by folks at home watching on the YouTube live stream and on the Toronto Star website. Special thanks to our media partner, the Toronto Star, and to our co-host, the Center for Media, Technology and Democracy at McGill University. Joining us here on stage as our co-host is Helen Hayes, Research Manager at the Center, and I'll throw it to you.
Great. Hi, everyone, and thanks to Kareem and Sam for collaborating with us on this amazing event. We're really thrilled to be here today and to have Frances join us, who's a senior fellow at our center at McGill. The center is an interdisciplinary research organization that's housed at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill, and our work is dedicated to understanding and responding to social, political, and policy challenges that are posed by the evolving digital media ecosystem. So I'll leave it at that. We're looking forward to the discussion today, and thanks to all of you for joining us.
You should know that the Sears Atrium and Toronto Metropolitan University are on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. We're covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. We in this room are all treaty people, and at TMU, we're committed to honoring our commitments and obligations to these nations' treaties and to justice for Indigenous peoples more generally. As part of our work in responsible tech, which is maybe the broader theme of today's conversation, we've been doing this at the DAIS through our partnerships with the Indigenous Friends Association, looking at the Indigenous technology workforce in Canada, and at our recent Democracy Exchange conference co-hosted with OCAD and the Open Democracy Project, where we hosted Indigenous scholars and leaders who shared their insights on Indigenous data sovereignty. And now I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator for this event, Regg Cohn. Martin is a political columnist for the Toronto Star, the founder of the TMU Democracy Forum, and a senior fellow at the DAIS. Take it away, Martin.
Thank you. Bienvenue, Boujou. I'll start from up here just to get us rolling. Welcome to the Democracy Forum at TMU, where we try to do democracy differently and more democratically. If you're watching on thestar.com, thanks for joining us. This is our 34th Democracy Forum at Toronto Met, but it's probably about the 5th, maybe the 6th panel that I've moderated on technology and democracy. And it doesn't get any easier for me or for any of us, because as the take-up increases, I think the apprehension keeps growing as well. That's why our topic today is suing social media. And that's the reference to the lawsuits that have been launched by some local school boards against 3 of the biggest social media platforms, and they're seeking $4.5 billion. Now, after we scheduled this event, the Ontario government weighed in with its own answer to social media addiction, and they announced a ban, a newer, tougher, broader ban on mobile phones in schools from kindergarten to grade 12. So lots to talk about today. Our topic, as you know, requires some expertise to help navigate this digital world. And we have 3 panelists who are on the front lines of the debate. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Frances Haugen is a data scientist and a whistleblower. She gained global attention for blowing the whistle on Facebook and Meta, going public about how the world's biggest platform exploited its algorithms to generate more anger and more money. She worked on its civic misinformation team dealing with threats to democracy and quickly learned that Facebook's business model was hurting democracy, hurting kids, and affecting all of us. Before that, she worked at Google, or I like to say she did no evil. She studied electrical and computer engineering at Olin College and has an MBA from Harvard. She's now a senior fellow, as you've heard, at McGill University's Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy. I always worry if that's an oxymoron, the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy, but it's a good name. Now, Frances has testified in the US Congress, in European parliaments, and a House of Commons committee here in Canada. And more importantly, she appeared at our Democracy Exchange Summit last month here at Toronto Met in a panel that I moderated. Welcome back, Frances. Rachel Chernos, who is closest to me. Francis, in case you didn't figure out, is at the far end. Rachel, who is closest to me, has been a school trustee for Don Valley West since 2018, and she's now chair of the Toronto District School Board, the biggest in the country. She chairs the Program and School Services Committee and is also a director with the Ontario Public School Boards Association. She has a master's in history from Brown University. She went to Brown Primary School, so it's all Brown. And she points out that she is a parent of TDSP graduates, and so am I. Welcome to TMU, Rachel.
Thank you.
Last but not least, in the middle is Dr. Alexia Pollio, who is a staff scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, also known as CAMH, working at the Slaight Family Center for Youth in Transition. Her research focuses on improving access with digital tools and social media to improve mental health for young people. She has a doctorate in experimental psychology from the University of Ottawa, and she did her postdoc at CAMH. Welcome to the Democracy Forum, Alexia.
Thank you.
So first, a bit of housekeeping. I will kick it off with the questions to start, gives you a chance to think up your own questions. We're going to try, given the theme today of digital democracy, to use the Slido app. It's not that hard, but you can just sign in and use it to ask your questions. It's a pretty friendly algorithm. It won't get you addicted, and there's a human override, me. And if that doesn't work, you can raise your hand and I'll recognize you. Okay, we can figure it out. So I'm going to start with a trick question and then I'll sit down. I always use this question, and this is for people in the audience, not for you on the panel, so you can't answer. Francis, you know what it's going to be. Does anyone know how many active users are on Facebook today? And the answer is 3.1 billion people. Instagram, 2 billion people. So 2 plus 3, that's 5 billion people combined for the two Meta properties, 5 billion. TikTok, don't want to forget TikTok. Any guesses? 1.7 billion users. And every time I use those numbers for these kinds of panels, I literally have to update it as much as 50%. It just keeps growing exponentially. I wish that were true of the Toronto Star, but we're not there. We were once. So the problem with these algorithms is that these anger algorithms sometimes are what allowed these platforms to scale up so much, and they can become addictive. And that is a segue for today's conversation. And so, Rachel, why don't you set the table for us, and then I'll come sit beside you. You're the chair of Canada's biggest school board, and you're suing Snapchat, TikTok, and Meta, the owner of Facebook and Instagram. And you allege that they, quote, intentionally amplify and push harmful content to maximize engagement. So the question is, how do they do that? And what are you trying to do about it?
So really for us, quite simply, the social media products and the disruptions that we were seeing in our schools on a daily basis were becoming more and more problematic. And it just got to a point where we had to do something about it. We could see the impact on our students on a daily basis. And there was also a very significant drain on our resources trying to manage that piece. And it came to a point really where something had to change. And that's why we decided that it was important to hold the social media giants accountable for the harm that they were creating and the disruption in our education system.
So why hand it off to lawyers? And how did you come up with $4.5 billion?
So, that's in some ways a question for the lawyers, but really what we are talking about is the harm that has been created, but also the future harm. And the aim of that is to account for that in terms of providing us with compensation for trying to rectify the harm and the future harm. But it's also about asking the companies to have some accountability and to create safer products that don't continue to do harm to young people.
Because there are costs, there are impacts on the students, but there are also costs in terms of having to allocate or reallocate teacher resources, board resources to cope with this. Question, though, the Premier, Doug Ford, criticized you, took a shot at you, as did the Education Minister, Stephen Lecce, saying that you should get back to basics and not be wasting money on this case. Now, I think you're going to tell us tell us what the fee structure is. I think it's a contingency plan. Explain that.
It is a contingency plan. There are no taxpayer dollars that are going towards this. The lawyers are working on contingency. So if there is a win, a payout, they get paid. If not, not. But the aim, and if we were to be successful, and I hope we will be successful, that would account for resources for students. We're talking about things like psychologists, social workers, IT help, more staff, but it's also the physical infrastructure that has been, quite frankly, repeatedly destroyed by students due to behavior. So that's multifaceted, what we're seeing. And, you know, as for the Premier's response, I think we've seen some change of heart in terms of where they're going with this, because they have come out with a bit of a different tune in the last few weeks.
We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. I have to ask you though, if you lose, they could ask for legal fees. Tell us what happens to your exposure, the risk that you're exposed to of losing in court and having a big legal bill.
So I think that's for the lawyers to determine. To be honest, I feel pretty confident that we're going to see some significant changes. The fact is, since we launched this suit, dinner table conversations have been different. We're starting to see change, not just from families, but the pressure being put on the social media giants from this discourse, from this discussion, from this honest discussion about what is actually happening to kids and the harm that's being created and continue to be created if there isn't change. So I feel pretty confident about it, and I feel really positive about the trajectory that we're going in.
I sure hope you don't lose. Okay, so Alexia, you've heard me and Rachel talk about as parents, the psychological concerns that we're worried about, the addiction. Tell us what you're seeing as a psychologist and an expert in the field. What does the evidence show? Are our kids and us all being turned into zombies, or is this a moral panic like we've seen in the past with I guess rock music and rap and video games, etc.? So give us what you
I
think.
should add that Martin just stole my line.
There you are. We'll talk.
Yeah, so I don't really have an exciting answer. When we look at the research broadly, we don't really know yet. But I think it's an exciting time to be doing social media research because we now have a lot of new tools that allow us to more objectively assess social media use. When I think about the kind of areas where we don't know, like where are the gaps, there's three. The first being that a lot of what we know is self-reported. So it relies on, people reflecting, young people reflecting, how long have you used social media in the past week? How long have you used it for the past month? And so there's a recall bias there. So we do need more objective assessments of social media, which now we're seeing things like mobile sensing, which I can get into. The second is a lot of it's cross-sectional, which means it's assessed at one time point. We don't really know over time, like as social media use changes over time, does youth mental health change over time? There's a couple of large longitudinal cohort studies. We have one at CAMH called the TAE cohort study. And then there's the ABCD study. And essentially what these studies do is they follow a large group of children over like 5 years, 10 years, and then they do multiple assessments in pretty much every area you can imagine, cognitive, biomarkers. And so these cohort studies are now starting to include structured, more validated social media use scales, but also mobile sensing, which is an app, which is ironic. So it's an app that's like installed on people's phones, and you can kind of tell it what you want it to do, but it could look at duration of use and types of platforms that are being used. And it's just meant to be a more accurate assessment of social media use. And this is this type of product is what's really being funded by the NIH now. So there's a number of new studies coming out that are kind of using this tool, so we can really understand social media use and the pros and the cons of it. And
Is it a question mark still? I mean, I get that we always need more research, and that's a serious answer from a researcher.
Yep.
But is it really indeterminate at this point, or is there enough evidence to be concerned?
I think that No, I wouldn't say there is. I think that we know there's correlations, there's associations between anxiety and depression, social media use. But we also know there's a lot of positives. People with mental illness who experience isolation or they're lonely, they're able to actually reach out, connect with people. So there are pros we're seeing in a correlation sense, and there's cons. But I think really, and one last thing is that we're really focused in the research on duration of use, but that may not be a predictor of worsening mental health outcomes. Like, how is social media actually being used, and how do we assess that? Think more insidious things like cyberbullying, misinformation, non-consensual sharing of text messages and photos, like revenge porn. All of these things may be things that may actually contribute to worse mental health. But yeah, so changing from duration of use to focusing on quality of use is something that we're going to see the direction take for social media
Because
research.
I get the duration isn't necessarily correlated to the bad
We all
outcomes.
use social media for
Right.
a long time.
And I'm old enough to remember when people were worried about watching too much TV.
Yeah, the
and,
Eminem album.
Yeah, and look what happened to me. So CAMH, I think, did a study that found that 1/3 of high school students are staring at their devices for at least 5 hours a day, which sounds like a lot.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, that's what we went through with watching Gilligan's Island and Hogan's
Yeah.
Heroes, none of which references students would understand. But and probably you too. Okay, but one of the challenges is that just to poke for a second, that's what big tobacco would have said in the 1960s.
Yeah.
But we don't really know
Yeah.
if cigarette smoking will hurt
Mhm.
lungs. And we've got to wait for the evidence, and that could take a generation or two for those longitudinal studies
For
to
sure.
come through. And we know that science changes, as my kids remind me from COVID.
Yeah.
We only know what we know day by day, year by year.
Yeah.
Maybe we shouldn't have locked up schools, right? So I guess the question is, with SARS and COVID, there's this precautionary principle that we're trying to embrace, that maybe you just need to be prudent and err on the side of caution. Isn't there an argument for that?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. I think we can all kind of, as like, whether you're a parent or someone who uses social media, you can kind of assume what is considered problem use in a way. Like, we don't have a standard definition of it, right? But like, not spending all of your day and all of your time on social media, that it's then affecting these other areas of your life, like school and your health. But I think I think we do need to take into account that, of course, down the line, we might be able to see some of these harms, but it's, I think it's a little more complex right now.
Okay, let's bring Frances into the conversation.
Yeah.
You've had a chance to look under the hood. You looked at the inputs. Rachel, Alexia is talking about the outcomes. When you looked at the inputs and you revealed as a whistleblower the internal studies that showed how Meta was not trying to, but was aware of the impacts in terms of body image, anxiety, all the other things that particularly could affect teenagers and Instagram. What did you see, and what are you worried about?
So actually, before we dive into that, I want to contextualize a little bit more about what the impact is on schools right now, because I think sometimes when we're in the day-to-day, we take for granted what people outside the school don't know. And I want to give you a little slice of how old I felt when I started talking to high school principals, like heads of school. So I got to speak at the graduation of the high school I went to, and I showed up, and the principal went, "Frances, I'm so glad you're here. The #1 thing I spend disciplinary time on is Instagram." And I remember just staring at him and being like, I can't fathom how that would be. Like, we usually talk about the harms of social media, and we talk about a depressed high school girl.
Yeah.
Depressed high school girls generally do not cause disciplinary problems as a general rule. And he's like, there is an anonymous fight club at the school run off of an Instagram account where we don't know who owns the account. All we know is that kids go and pick fights with kids who do not consent, beat them up, film them, and put them on Instagram. And I've asked Instagram repeatedly, please take this account down, and they won't. And that account got taken down as soon as I started talking about it in the media. And so the question I want to highlight on is the evidence, part of why I came forward with such a large pile of evidence, and why I'm so grateful that lawsuits like the one the school district have brought out 10 times as much information through discovery, is it paints a picture of the question is not, do we turn on social media or do we turn it off or leave it on or turn it off? The question is, what should the balance of power be? Because the platforms knew they had lots and lots and lots of tools to do harm reduction on these products, to take the bad parts and make the bad parts less bad while leaving up the good parts. For example, taking down a Fight Club account should not be a hard decision, but heads of school have no rights to even have a priority channel for feedback, or companies aren't liable for facilitating this kind of behavior. What we've seen since in the lawsuits are things like the platforms ran experiments. So one, they went and talked to our kids. It's not like they don't know kids are suffering. They went out there, they talked to our kids. Our kids said things like, when you send me notifications during the school day, it's hard for me to focus. I feel really anxious. Like if I'm trying to decide between paying attention in math class and I feel my phone buzz and I have to like do that self-control to not look at it. I feel anxious in that gap. So often I do look at it. I interrupt my school day. It's hurting my productivity. When I get a notification late at night, it's hard for me to sleep. Similarly, I feel like anxious. I know what I should be doing versus I know what like I feel tempted to do. It's a loop where I keep staying up later and later. And like sleep deprivation is the #1 risk factor for mental health issues for kids, for performance in school, which lasts with them for a lifetime, chance of dying from accidents, not just car accidents, but generalized, chance of substance use, uppers because they're tired, downers because they're depressed. Facebook went and ran experiments and said, okay, let's turn off notifications. Remember, we're not talking about, do we get to have social media, do we not? We're talking about, do we just blunt the damage? Surprise, kids reported, I feel less anxious. I feel more productive. I can sleep better. Facebook looked at the experiment results and said, but they used the product about 1% less. We know Mark Zuckerberg really cares about this metric. I don't think we can ship it. So that's the conversation we should be having. It's not a question of like, do we know for certain if kids use social media, they're harmed? We know when we talk to kids, they say, this makes me unhappy. If I could, I spent 3 hours yesterday talking to kids in middle grade 7, 8, 9, 10, that kind of thing. And I asked them, if you could wave a magic wand and your younger sibling would never use social media, would you wave it? And all of them said yes, right? Kids know these things. And yet we're not having a conversation about what are the obligations of these platforms to do better. We're having conversation and someone has to pay those costs. When you, sorry, go ahead.
Francis,
I'll stop monologuing.
is it fair to say?
I'm politicianing. I was told not to.
No, but you raise important points,
No.
and you talked about
No.
self-regulation as something that's out there. Sometimes educators talk about teaching kids, psychologists, parents talk about self-regulation. I'm not very good at it if there's a tub of ice cream in front of me. And so self-regulation surely should apply to the platforms as well. Surely they should be self-regulating and trying to curb that impulse to be greedy about harvesting all those notifications. Okay, so you asked a question, or I was hoping you'd recap a little bit about more about what you saw at Instagram and circle back to the harms that were visited upon girls. But let's talk about litigation since you raised that tool.
Well,
I guess the
potential
potential of litigation is that you can impose discovery on the other side and get some of those documents. You saw some of those documents as a whistleblower and felt they had to be made public. So tell us about that.
My core issue was actually not kids when I came forward. The core issue, and so I brought 22,000 pages of documents. 75% of it was around the idea that Facebook knew a lot about how its algorithms worked. They knew that its algorithms were powerful enough that political parties across Europe said when Facebook changed the algorithm, they had to start running different positions because they knew that more extreme content got distributed and something like a white paper on agricultural policy didn't get distributed. They would say, we're running things we know our constituents don't like that much, but we have jobs to do. So we have to, you run what you run. In the case of teen girls, that meant things like when you have an algorithm that rewards extreme content, you can start from something neutral. And just by clicking on what is provided to you, following the hashtag they suggest, because the algorithm is agnostic in the words of the platforms, it doesn't understand the significance of content, you can be pushed from a neutral topic to an extreme topic like eating disorder content or self-harm content. And in documents from the filings, there are quotes like, Rabbit holes aren't accidents, right? Rabbit holes are the natural consequence of algorithms that just keep trying to maximize our willingness to engage with these products.
That's how I get stuck in these algorithms of dogs and cats going to sleep together, because
They're just so cute.
it just keeps perpetuating itself. Okay, so you've spoken. I want to circle back to our other guests, but I want to just when we talk about litigation, you've also spoken about, and last time we had a panel together, about the online harms legislation that is being debated in Canada right now. It took a long time to come to fruition. There was a lot of consultation, a lot of research, but it's now being debated. But when you look at online harms legislation, litigation, or prohibition with cell phones, which we'll talk about in a minute, how do you see them all fitting together?
So you said earlier, like, shouldn't there be an obligation for these platforms to, do the responsible thing? Like, where's the self-control there? And the issue around systems that don't have feedback cycles is they drift. And in the case of social media platforms, every single one of us in this room sees a different vision of social media. Like, part of why I wanted to paint a little bit more of a picture of what it's like in schools is because you're looking at cute puppies and dogs. Puppies and dogs don't ruin democracy.
Also cats. Sorry.
Cats, excuse me. Sorry, puppies and
Dogs are a dime a
yeah,
dozen.
sorry. Kittens are cuter, I get it. But when we each see a different thing, it's hard for us to know what is representative. And it means that companies can do things like invest in more safety systems for, say, people who vote more. And they do. They'll do less safety systems for kids because kids don't set policy. One of the things we found from the filings was safety systems for kids that were present on Facebook weren't even rebuilt on Instagram, probably because they didn't think there would be consequences. What the online harm bill does, and I think it's really important, is it introduces a feedback cycle. So right now, the platforms know the risks of their products. For example, in the notifications thing, they would have had to disclose, we know that notifications can be distracting for kids. And if they hadn't, the government could say, hey, we've heard reports, these are distracting for kids. And they would have an obligation to come up with a plan to reduce that harm and give us enough data that we could watch the progress of that plan. That introduces an incentive beyond, can we make as much money as possible for the lowest amount of expenses? Because remember, safety is expensive. It's a cost center. It doesn't make more profits. And so I think that's part of why it's so important for us to be having a conversation around what are the rights of Canadians when it comes to these systems? Do we have the right to ask questions and get answers? Because we've gotten a 20-year track record on what happens when we don't have the right to have access to the truth.
And safety is not just a cost center. It's an opportunity cost. It gets in the way of potential profit, of unrealized profit down the road. Okay, let's just remind the audience that Toronto was not, even though you're very brave, it wasn't the first school board to launch a lawsuit. I think it started about a year ago in Seattle, and something like 500 lawsuits going on. It's the first in Canada. But I want to just switch the pace for a second, and a question for all of you. We'll start with Rachel. So couldn't we just short circuit the problem by banning mobile phones? So we had the education minister, Stephen Lecce, at the Democracy Forum earlier this year. He talked about the possibility of a ban, and a lot of the students in the audience nodded in agreement because they were out of high school and they understood that they were as addicted as he is. He carries 2 cell phones. A few days ago, he followed through and announced the ban. So as I said, it's students from kindergarten to grade 12. It's a tighter ban on students in the early grades. They have to keep the phones in silent, out of sight, out of mind, or out of sight at least. I think your argument is they're not always out of mind because it's an addiction, and you're thinking about it. So would this work? What are the problems with it? What's the upside, Rachel?
Well, I think it's one important piece of the puzzle. I do. This is something that, of course, the TDSB had launched as well earlier prior to this. In January, we embarked on starting a new policy around cell phone use because we were finding that what we were doing in schools was not working.
And
it might work in some classes, but not everywhere.
Sorry to interrupt. Allegedly, there was a ban put in place in 2019 by Mr. Lecce shortly after he became minister. He inherited the policy from his predecessor, but the ban wasn't working. So this is a new, tougher, broader ban.
Well, we haven't exactly decided what ours will be, but the government has come in with recommendation, well, they will be guidelines, they're memorandum for specific age groups. And, kids will have to put them away during the daytime if they're up to grade 6. And after that, they can't have them in class. They can have them between class. Unless, of course, a teacher says it's for educational purposes in any case. And
Yeah,
then
there's
they
an
would be able
exception
to.
for
There-
technological use.
There are exceptions. I don't know if this is where we would have landed. I think there are some challenges with it. And I know, it's not necessarily, the audience isn't interested necessarily in a whole lot of specifics, but for us, I look at, why would we want kids to have it in grade 7 and 8 at recess? I'm not sure we would. This is something that we would have wanted to engage stakeholders, and I mean educators, parents, experts, to decide that.
So you might want middle school kids to also have a tighter band.
Maybe. But part of the challenge, and for me, is that this is just one piece of the puzzle. Because when we think about how kids are using social media, and we know from studies like the CAMH one, how much they're on Instagram and TikTok and other pieces, and the harm that that's creating, they're literally rolling out of bed and getting on TikTok. They're coming out of class, they're getting on their phone. And I know I see people in the audience nodding, but I know we are too as adults. But as adults, we have a prefrontal lobe that's fully developed. It's a little bit different. So putting it out of sight does not mean it's necessarily out of mind. I'm not saying it isn't a good thing for us to start thinking about doing things differently in our classroom. And I mean, this is something that the TDSB is really engaged in very seriously, because we do believe it's a significant problem in our schools, but we know it's not the full solution. And I really do believe that. Like, kids spending hours and hours online, I don't think it's exactly akin to what we thought of with TV.
No, I mean,
back
TV
then.
is like broadcasting, whereas this is endless, infinite connectivity and all kinds of follow. I should say that the province has also asked school boards, if I understand correctly, to remove access to these social media platforms from your Wi-Fi and devices. Is that right?
They have, and we actually had already we had been directed to remove TikTok for a different reason. But that is one of the pieces, that there will no longer be social media on all boards. It's not just us, it's throughout the province. Now, there are potential challenges with that, because we know most kids have their own devices, like they have their own phones,
Sure.
They have data plans. They also are really smart with technology, and they can potentially create VPNs and have all different ways around it. But that said, I do believe it's an important step in the right direction. And I'm glad that the province came on board on this. And also they're talking about it. The fact that they're talking about it, we're talking about it. These are really significant pieces in changing the direction that we're going in.
I was laughing because when you said data plans and kids, I mean, the cool thing about kids is they know exactly where they are on their data plan at any point in time in Canada, not in the US, where data is almost free. Alexia,
Yeah.
so what's the downside of this? Will prohibition turn mobile phones into the forbidden fruit? Will it make it even more tantalizing if it's out of reach and very much in mind?
Yeah, so I think I agree with Rachel too, with everything she said. I think also too, it's difficult to enforce, but I also think that there's other pieces that we're missing. So at CAMH, we did a study where we ran focus groups with youth and asked them about their experiences with social media and cyberbullying. And they highlighted a couple of areas where there's needs within schools as well that aren't being met. One of the things that they talked about was that they didn't really feel like school was a safe environment to report cyberbullying or these types of social media issues. They felt like teachers were not equipped to deal with it. And not that it was the teacher's fault, but the teachers just didn't have the tools to deal with it. And because social media happens in this very public space and it's anonymous, it's very hard to hold people accountable. So there was this like, young people were like, well, what's the point of even reporting it, right? Nothing's going to get done. And another area where they talked about need is the lack of mental health resources, which like no one is surprised by that in this room, I'm sure. When they did bring social media issues or cyberbullying issues to the school, it was like, well, here's the crisis line, the children's help phone, more emergency services. And this is just speaking to the youth that we talk to, of course. It's not all, this doesn't, we can't generalize this. And then on top of that, being a young person, it's such a difficult, vulnerable time in their lives. There's cognitive changes, developmental changes, social changes, and we know that it's the onset of mental illness. We know mental illness is a young person's disease. So throwing these other experiences into the mix, youth are worried about reporting as well, right? They don't want to seem like they can't take a joke. They don't want loss of social, their social lives, or friendships. So those are, I think, 3 areas. And one last thing, CAMH is we're partnering with the Child Mind Institute in New York, and they did a study and to do this social media work. And they did a study, which is really interesting. They did a large survey to parents and children in the US. They actually found that problem internet use was correlated in parents, was correlated with problem internet use in children, which is really interesting.
Mhm.
So that's an area for intervention, right? Like, can parents modify their use and model better use? And could that then trickle down to children? So I think we also need to consider all of these other areas to approach this issue as well. And the social media companies, of course.
Francis, before I turn to you on cell phones, it's worth noting that the Progressive Conservatives, the governing party, did their own polling on this. And unsurprisingly, I think 75% of parents, voters, support the ban, and 90% agree that it is distracting for their kids. Just a programming note, if I'm not mistaken, Catherine, I think we are not having any take up on our Slido app. So I think this assembly is turning thumbs down on Slido, or the code, Catherine will have to tell us the code because that's the trick. It's technology. Don't worry, we will abort if need be. This is like a thumbs down so far on Slido. At our previous events, everyone loved Slido, but not this crowd. That's fine. Okay. Sorry, Francis.
I think it's an access code issue, so they can't get in right now.
I understand. Yeah.
Very good, very good. What was the question?
Just on cell phones and banning.
Phones, yeah.
Thoughts?
So I think part of what I actually kind of like about the lawsuits, and this is one of these things where the more robust solution is passing legislation that allows us to have an ongoing, evolving relationship between the public and these companies. But in the meantime, while we don't have something like systematic regulation in the US and Canada, one of the things that's interesting about lawsuits is, so when we talk about these things of fostering, like banning a phone in school doesn't stop the cyberbullying.
No. Right.
So cyberbullying, just for context, again, these are things where like I felt really old when I was learning about them. So I'm always like, let's translate the younger experience. Right now, when you go home, you start getting bullied online if you're having a bad experience. It used to be you would go home from school, you get off the bus, no bullying until the next morning. You get, most kids come from good families. You get a chance to rest, restore, come back in. It might be real bad for 8 hours, but you get a reset. And today, like even if you ban phones in schools, that cyberbullying still picks up when the kid gets home. Yeah. And it goes on all the way until they go to bed. And they wake up in the morning and they might see messages that came in while they were sleeping of someone being mean to them. Yeah. And because there isn't those feedback cycles that you get in person, even tweens can be really cruel to each other, but at the same time, if I make you cry, I still see you cry. Like most kids are not enough sociopaths that doesn't at least kind of hurt them. Online, you can make someone cry and there's none of that feedback cycle. Yeah. And so when we say the costs to the school districts, if that child shows up and is having a mental health crisis because they are getting piled on at home, it doesn't fall on the platforms to pay for that cost. It falls on the cost of the school to now have to have more counselors on hand, or to have a teacher get burned out because they're the empathetic one. And so kids keep coming to them and not the other teacher to pile on about how they're struggling. And we're seeing more reports from teachers who have been teaching for 20 years saying the 7th graders that are showing up today don't behave like ones I've taught at any point in my career. Right, they're more volatile. They're struggling more. They're not performing at grade level, because if you have these phones and if you have these distractions, you just don't make the same progress.
2 very quick questions before we open it to the floor. Rachel, your lawsuit mentions TikTok, Snapchat, and Meta. You don't, as far as I can tell, you're not suing YouTube. How come? Because most of the American school boards are going after YouTube and Google?
Yeah, that's really a question for our legal team,
Okay.
Martin. I'm
I have a
gonna leave
long
it at
list of
that.
questions for your legal team now. Okay,
And
no worries,
you know,
that's fine.
these are the ones that are that we know are particularly problematic
Sure.
for kids.
The lawsuit, this is a question for Alexia now. Your lawsuit the statement of claim talks about maladaptive brain development, compulsive use, behavioral dysregulation, attention impairment, and the allegation is that these platforms have rewired the way children think, behave, and learn. Are children's brains being rewired, do you think, by social media?
I don't think we have any conclusive evidence to indicate that. I think this is also, this social media and what's happening is happening at a time where there are cognitive changes. There are studies that have been done that do show similar, like when we're thinking about like cognitive control, which is, for example, the notification pops up. Can you control yourself to not check your phone in that second? We are seeing some studies that indicate that it is similar to substance use and these other addictive behaviors. But there's, if we took social media out of the equation, would that still be happening anyways, right? Like that wasn't a very scientific way of saying it, but.
I mean, when you think about, I was talking to my kids about Snapchat and how it encouraged kids to keep up a streak so that you don't fall behind,
Like
the fear of missing
incentive?
out. Yeah, to keep on
Yeah.
clicking and getting
Yep.
back on Snapchat. So, all right, questions from the audience in real human terms. You were first up with that hand. So yeah, you don't need an app, you've got the hand. Yeah.
And we can
Sure.
repeat
We have a
back.
mic.
By the way.
All right.
Yeah.
There. Okay. Just a question I've been formulating when I first read about this topic in the forum. I was even here yesterday, but didn't mean to do that really. I hear words of ban, I hear words of force, I hear words of regulation, and I'm just curious if we can back ourselves up to what efforts are being used now to teach social media users. And I'm not going to say just youth and kids, because my first encounter negative was with social media was when I went to Toronto Operetta and the lady in front of me with
Right.
a cell phone and talking away and turn that damn thing off. But it's technology and I'm supposed to use it. But my question is, what's being done to help our students, teach them social protocols about etiquette? Thank you. Yeah.
And digital literacy. So
Yeah.
so is there a way to inculcate that in kids?
Yeah, in this, just to kind of touch on that, in the cyberbullying study, I forgot to mention this. This was another area of need that young people felt like it was what they're getting is very kind of stranger danger type stuff. Like, don't give your credit card number, don't tell people your address. It wasn't actually like, how do we use social media use safely? How do you, there was youth talked about they had to do their own self-organizing, right? They had to actually go and seek out the information. Some of them were giving their own workshops of like, this is how you create, you curate your Instagram. So it's like safer, like, unfollowing people with, that are harmful for body image. They're actually having to take initiative into their own hands to curate like a safe social media space for themselves.
And I want to actually signal boost something you said earlier about how kids are being actively trained to not act by the negligence of these platforms. So for example, one of the shocking things that came out from the large whistleblower in the fall, and these documents are part of the lawsuits, was that 1 in 8 girls between the ages of 13 and 15 got unwanted sexual communication in the last 7 days.
Yeah.
And when you actually look at those documents, that means 13% of girls got an unwanted communication in the last week. 1 to 2% got 10 or more in the last week. That's what the charts say. And when you have a system where if you report it, nothing happens.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you sit in school and are told, here's the safety tools that are available. If the safety tools are a farce or they're not willing to allocate resources to actually do something, you teach kids, and kids actively say this. They say, this is the cost of being online. I have to accept being treated this way because if I want to be online.
They feel they have no choice.
Yeah.
There's no alternative for
Yeah.
them.
And I would just add, we are doing digital literacy. That is part of the curriculum. It is becoming more embedded, but you have to remember the technology changes very quickly. The amount of professional development, the investment in professional development in education has gone down significantly in the last 6 years on a massive scale. So keeping up with it is very challenging, but we are seeing workshops for parents. We are seeing workshops for kids, having specialists come in. We are seeing it become embedded in the curriculum. But I would just challenge us to think about the fact that why is it up to us to rectify this problem? Why are the companies who are creating this not being tasked with fixing it? And that's really at the heart of what we're talking about, in my opinion.
And I guess your argument is they broke it, they should fix it or at least pay for it. But your obligation, as we both know, is you have that custodial responsibility. So you
Yes.
can't duck, but it's a fair.
We're going to do
rhetorical question.
everything we can to help kids and to fix this for kids. But at the end of the day, we don't want to continue harming kids. And if we're not fully capable of getting to that place, we need some help getting there. And the companies who are creating algorithms that are creating harm and knowingly doing that need to fix that.
And making lots of money off of ads in the process.
And they need to be held accountable. That's really, at the end of the day, a big part of it.
This gentleman, one of these gentlemen caught my eye, but before I go to you, Slido has come to life remarkably. And so I just want to segue to a question that is tied to what we were just talking about. So, because you talked about money, and here's a question: if money was no object, how would we equip the schools and resource the teachers to deal with the rising mental health issues in youth? So what's your wish list?
Well, I'd love to have, there are studies, we've seen studies that show, you know, one social worker or mental health worker for 300 students is the ideal. We're nowhere near that. But I'm not even sure we have that many in our system, not just like in the public school system, but in society to help with that, because we need more in our schools, but we also hear challenges of wait lists outside of school. And we also hear challenges of the costs associated with that, right? Because not everybody has private insurance. Not everybody gets it. There's not a very large number of mental health aspects that you can get through OHIP. So there's challenges there. But, you know.
But if the jury was looking at you and saying, okay, you won the case, here's your money, but what are you going to spend it on?
I would spend it on resources for kids. Hands down, we need more resources in our classrooms. But I would also want them to fix these apps so that we don't continue this cycle of harm. That's a really important piece of this. But it would absolutely be more money for social workers, more money for psychologists, more money for child and youth workers, more money for special needs assistants, more money for all of the challenges that we're seeing, the significant behavior challenges, the attention span issues, the tutoring that we would need to get back up. Because there have been significant interruptions because of kids not being able to concentrate and the challenges that they're bringing to the classroom from what they're experiencing online.
I would go one level higher, because you said money's no problem here, right? We get whatever we want. Remember, I'm always very careful when we talk about like ban, no ban, to ask like, why do kids feel so pressured to be on social media? And a lot of that is, for a lot of kids, they have no place to socialize in person, right? And like, if you really care about making sure we have a democracy in the future, that kids know how to connect and communicate with each other, you fund after school programs. You make it so you can have drama teams and debate teams and like lots and lots and lots of opportunities for kids to have spaces to hang out even in the evening, because that's how they actually learn those social skills. And we had those things at a much greater extent in the 60s and 70s.
And all of those upstream programs that you're talking about pay off later. They're so important in terms of our kids having, you know, all kids, but particularly at-risk kids, having those upstream options so that we don't end up in a place where it is actually much more expensive and much sadder in the future.
I'm suddenly feeling very self-conscious and guilty to have a mobile phone in my hand. It's not because I'm getting notifications, it's because I'm trying to keep an eye on Slido. So this is actually work related. And this gentleman right in front of me. Yeah, who was it? There you are. Yeah, caught my eye.
Well, actually, we've already covered that with this young lady over here, and that is educating our children. But I'd like to underscore that and highlight it even more. I think it's great that we're going after perpetrators or what we deem could be the problem. But I think the attitude also should shift towards empowering our children rather than seeing them as potential victims that we need to protect. And let's get our social workers, our psychologists in there. No, let's get to the children. Lecce talked about get back to basics. I would counter to him and say, well, part of the basics would be educating children on technology. It wouldn't just be how to use it, how it works, algorithms, but also the deeper, more profound values that go into it, such as values, cooperation, how to treat other people, these kind of things.
Okay, so the question is again, on digital literacy, but I guess the other question is how do you do that? How do you inculcate that in someone who's in kindergarten, grade 1 or 2? But is that a path that's being neglected? Is inculcating those ideas of so that we're not just letting kids off the hook, as it were?
I believe we are doing those things in our classrooms each and every day. I do believe teachers are talking to kids about being empathetic, about kindness. I can tell you, I've been working on a ward forum that's coming up just on kindness. We see all sorts of initiatives about this, collaboration. You see much more group work from a young age in classrooms. So these are the kind of pieces that are certainly important. And I would agree with you. Back to basics. I understand we're talking about math and literacy, but I don't think there's anything basic about education in the 21st century. We need kids to become critical thinkers, especially when we're talking about social media and what they're seeing online. They need to be able to go backwards and fact check everything they're looking at, because the algorithms teach them things that are not necessarily what's true or what's accurate. So these are the kind of soft skills that we need at every level. And I would say teachers are trying very hard to embed all of those pieces, but it's a real challenge given the resources that they have and the challenges that they're facing in the classroom each and every day.
And I'll give you a little tiny portrait of like, what does it mean to be a 14-year-old girl today? So yesterday, one of the questions we asked them was like, what do you think about banning phones in schools? And one of the kids was like, I think it's really stressful because I would get home at the end of the day and there'd be a pile of messages that I'd have to respond to. And I was like, well, if all your friends also couldn't have their phones in school all day, they wouldn't send those messages to you. And it was like a little light bulb went in her eye. So right now we're asking kids kind of 3 states of being. We're like, hey, do you leave your phone at home all day? Do you leave it in your locker between class except for between classes? Or do you take it into class? So if you take it into class, you get the message as soon as it comes in. So if none of your friends have it in class also, that message won't come in. You don't need to have it there. If it's in your locker, you still have to go check it every class. And that's what the kids said they were doing right now. Was at every single passing period, they'd go and respond to their messages. Or you have a thing where you say, hey, phones just need to not be in schools. And now it's not sitting there being like, oh my God, like, what am I missing right now? Like, did someone, tar and feather my name and I need to jump in and save the situation? And the cost of having it on your lap or having it in your bag and you can feel it when it vibrates, some studies go as high as a half a year lost each year of instruction of having your phone in your lap when you're in class. And so that's kind of the choices that kids are wrestling with today when we don't think of this as a collective problem instead of an individual problem.
One thing I also want to add is I completely agree with everything you said. I hate when we take like a very paternalistic view towards youth, because they're incredibly resilient. They grew up with technology and social media. They should be a part, really, like we're like, the experts here. We could have had a young person on this panel to speak to the exact same things that we're speaking about. So youth need to be involved in these decisions. They're a stakeholder group. They know probably more than some of us in this room know. So I think that's a huge piece, is that youth need to have a voice, and we can't be making sweeping decisions without proper evidence and without having youth involved in those decisions.
And I would completely agree. And I would just say that the policy that we have been working on at TDSB, that pathway that we had been building was involving significant focus groups of young people, because they are important stakeholders, and any policy decision that you make has to involve stakeholder input if it's going to be successful. So that is one of the challenges that we're going to have to manage as we bring in what the government has asked us to do with the policy that we're also developing, because young people are really smart and they're going to help lead us to what the right answer is here.
Okay. I have a question here on Slido from Siri. but it's not the Apple Siri, it's actually Siri. A girl who has heard this joke many times, I'm sure. And I'm going to read out your question, or you can read it, Siri, because I'm looking at you. Will there be psychological supports? You can add. Will there be psychological supports in place to coincide with the school ban? I think she's on the same page as you. All right. The addiction is so deep that cold turkey may create a different kind of crisis.
That's a great question and something we are really going to have to wrestle with for September. We do have lots of social workers in TDSB. Every board is different, but that's a really great point and something that I know we're going to have in place. I think we have been moving in that direction in many classrooms since we've started talking about this, especially at TDSB, because we had launched this policy. So you're starting to see many more classes and many elementary schools actually having phones put away over this past year. And that has been growing. My understanding from reading studies where they have done this is that the first week is really hard and it gets easier each week, and that kids actually adapt quite quickly. So it is something we have to keep our eye on. I think it's a great question and something we have to be mindful of. But this is part of also educating our staff as to how to support our kids, because really it's those teachers who are on the front line and those educators who are on the front line who have connections with kids who are going to be the ones who will be really helpful in these places. And so it will be working with our social work team and our staff to educate.
Alexia, any thoughts about that? About how to, okay.
No.
I'm going to just give one more question to Slido, and then we'll go back to the public here, because it's an interesting capture of Slido. It's from Kareem Bardisi, who owns this platform and now owns Slido because he got the most votes. His question is there evidence that siblings can influence each other's social media use?
Great question.
Or that kids can influence their parents to be less frequent users? Maybe those smart kids can actually save us. Any thoughts?
Maybe you can get the boomers off Facebook.
Say again?
Maybe you can get the boomers off Facebook.
Yeah, well, I don't think kids know anything about Facebook, though. That's the thing, right?
I can tell you that my kids have probably made the most significant attempts to change my behavior, because now that we're talking about it a lot, they are very quick and they quite enjoy pointing out to their parents when
No kidding.
they are being a little bit hypocritical and picking up that phone at the dinner table, you know, or taking it to bed with you, or, you know, not paying attention when they're asking you a question because you're sitting on your phone. These are all things that have happened to me recently.
If we could construct an app that would allow parents to monitor kids and vice versa, you might have a gamification that actually helps us. So.
One of the, I think, most shocking documents around kids from the Facebook files was around, they sent in anthropologists to look at families. And they said, we've done a lot of focus groups on kids. We've done some focus groups on adults. We don't study family systems, like family ecosystems, because like each member of the family plays a different role. Yeah. And they're saying that, so when the study was done, it's probably around 2019, 2020. So remember, Instagram only gets more popular every year. Like there weren't a lot of adults on Instagram. And they're saying teenagers played a really critical role in terms of introducing Instagram into families, because they would educate their tween siblings, who should not have been on there anyhow, but they would educate the tween siblings on things like, you know, if you post something, it'll be there forever. And at the same time, they also did a lot of bringing on board parents. And the thing that was shocking about this document was not that they were sending an anthropologist and talking to people, it was how they contextualized the findings they found. So for example, in the case of that teen sibling trying to protect their their younger sibling, brother or sister, they frame them as these teenagers are spreading dangerous myths. Things like you can't be your authentic self on Instagram, right? It's going to cause sharing problems in the future. And so we have to remember that when we have closed systems where the only numbers we have to report publicly are profit and loss, the frame of reference is about growth. It is not about the costs of that system, or say trying to erode that relationship between that brother and a sister.
I can tell you that trying to moderate a panel while also keeping an eye on Slido is very distracting. So you have to bear with me. A question from Dana Kramer: how can youth networks and volunteer youth nonprofit organizations help achieve issues related to online harms and support youth in the digital realm? So how do NGOs and volunteer groups play their part? Francis.
I think it's really, so like I said before, like, you know, we've been having a fraying of our public spaces for decades. And I think one of the most important roles for nonprofits is saying like, how do we rebuild our in-person communities? Like a community garden is important because it gives things like intergenerational spaces, right? When we talk about, we literally don't have enough counselors in society to meet the needs at the level that we're talking about. Guess what? We have really cool grandmas who like to plant tomatoes, right? Like figuring out like, what are the spaces where we say like kids shouldn't be segregated. They're not a separate part of society. They're in our societies. And when we have spaces where they feel supported and they have like communities that aren't necessarily like, if you have a kid who's being bullied, having a more permeable society where we say we live here together means they have someone to complain to or be like, I have another space. Like I'm not just vulnerable to my, like I'm not dependent on my peer group exclusively. And so I think that's my fantasy for like, where do we grow forward? Is we have social media has facilitated us not watering our garden, right? Because we can get the cheap fix of social interaction. And we together are going to have an obligation to rebuild those spaces over the next 10 years.
Because the idea of freeing kids, liberating kids from their phones is not just to let them pay attention in class, it's also the social interaction, not just the education part of it. I'm going to liberate myself from Slido for this one question. Is there a question from the floor? One last question from the floor because we're in overtime. Okay, there's one hand that went up really fast. Woman in the green jacket. Yes. There you
Oh,
are.
thank you very much. I want to thank you so much. I enjoyed it a lot. I do want to make a little connection between what you were talking about today and also the refusal to put news on online social spaces. You talked a lot about disinformation and kids learning to have digital literacy, to fact check, and that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering if you can maybe talk about some of those connections.
Are you referring to Facebook sort of removing news from questions?
That's right. Yeah, refusing to publish.
See how this human interaction works so beautifully. You read my mind. Okay.
Thanks.
Francis, why don't you start with that?
One of the things I'm always trying to reassure places that have stood up to these platforms when they say things like, well, they took the news away because we passed this law. We actually stood up to them and said, hey, news is a vital part of democracy. Like if you're going to kill the business model, like we have to figure out how to make sure we don't let the kind of yeast of democracy die too. Is that even in the United States where we didn't pass a law, over the last 2.5 years, they've progressively taken more and more news off. And just maybe 2 months ago, they announced a new setting in Instagram, which they did not, say you can turn on. They turned it on by default of stopping distribution of the news everywhere, right? Unless you went in and turned that little slider, you don't get the news on Instagram anymore. And so I think the really important thing to remember is that these platforms have really interesting choices to make. They can go in there and do product-based changes. This is things like saying, when you reshare a story, should you have to click on it first?
Right.
Like, should you have to know what you're going to share? That reduces misinformation 10 or 15%. But it also reduces how much content goes around the system. And so maybe it's a fraction of a percent less profitable. Instead of making those changes, they've been saying, let's just try to step out of this whole conversation. Like if we take the news off, we can't argue about over distributing the negative news versus the positive news, or the inflammatory news versus the more moderate news. And I think the thing that's really concerning about this is we don't know what they mean by the news, right? They haven't published a list of forbidden publications or blogs. They haven't said these topics are not allowed. When I was at Facebook, we definitely had categories of topics that we considered civic, and those were treated differently. None of these things are transparent. And in a world where we are told we can't have information about current events, but we're not going to tell you when that counts, that actually shapes democracy. And it is unacceptable to do in a unilateral way in a democracy. So I think this is a symptom of a reoccurring pattern. They hold all the cards. They think they are immune from consequences, and that as long as they can operate behind a curtain, they can do whatever they want to do. And that's unacceptable. And it's time to stand up and demand more.
And that's what happens when you have 5 billion active users. It's kind of a neat trick, though, that they pretended they were punishing us for the online harm or the media legislation. But the truth is they had already decided that on their algorithm that today's news was yesterday's.
It's about 80, it was about 80% less already by the time they turned it off.
Okay, we're in overtime. I have one last quick trick question for the panel this time, and that is, are you on TikTok? Are you on Facebook? Are you on Instagram? Which is worse? And, well, then I have a follow-up question. So Rachel first.
I am not on TikTok.
Right.
I do receive the occasional TikTok from my youngest daughter, and they're often very funny. I'm not going to lie. But I'm not on TikTok. I am on Facebook, and I've used it a little bit for work. I'm on LinkedIn. Like, honestly, I'm on LinkedIn.
You're still
and
LinkedIn.
X. I'm not. I try to be, but for work,
Okay.
I do use X. But that's
Alexia,
different.
quickly.
I'm on everything.
Which is the worst?
Oh, which is the word? I'm obsessed with Reddit. So that,
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
a Reddit
Yeah.
girly. So that's my social media platform, but I do also like TikTok in terms of what's more harmful, probably TikTok, I would say. The algorithm's very, very sensitive.
Yeah.
So you got to really be careful on
A
it.
very clever algorithm. Francis,
I am.
knowing what you know from looking
Well,
under the hood.
Yeah, she has the expertise on this.
Like I
What are your
fully
guilty
admit,
pleasures?
I get criticized all the time by people who like do comms being like, you don't post often enough, because I don't. So I only ever post basically on Twitter because it's the least effort. But I have a 2024 goal to start doing TikToks and YouTube
Ooh.
because I really believe that where democracy is today is if you are not participating on YouTube, you're not participating in democracy. And in the case of this question of how do we demand that youth get a seat at the table, if you don't do TikTok, you are not including youth.
100%.
And so it doesn't matter that I don't want to do it. That's what you have to do if you want to actually have public conversations today. But in terms of what is most dangerous, I want to just take a tiny little moment and talk about the TikTok divestment bill, because it is not a TikTok ban. That is TikTok's framing. Don't borrow it. Don't repeat it. One of the most important facts to leave with today is we know from multiple whistleblowers that TikTok has the ability to heat content. They could choose what they want to send viral. And that makes up 1% to 2% of everything that's seen on TikTok in any given day. I want you to take for a moment, as you say, like, if someone asks you about TikTok divestment, about what should we do about TikTok in society, or what's the role in society, do you want a company where multiple whistleblowers have said the actual people running the company are not sitting in Singapore, they're not sitting in the United States, they're sitting in Beijing? Do you want a company like that to get to choose what 2% of everything people see in society is on any given day? And how could that shift public conversation? So I'd say TikTok is the most dangerous.
Okay. We are out of time. I'm going to hand the microphone back to Kareem in a second. I first want to sneak in a thanks to Rachel, Alexia, and Francis, and to all of you in the audience, and to the Toronto Star for live streaming this event and being our media sponsor. Over to you, Kareem.
Thank you so much. This is such a rich conversation, and with not easy answers, but really a really rich conversation, which will continue over the TMU Eats provided cookies, coffee, and tea if you're in the room. And thanks to Silvana Babican and her team for helping provide that. Thanks to our friends at McGill's Center for Media Technology and Democracy for bringing Francis Haugen to Canada this week. Thanks to Alexia Pollio and Rachel Chernos Lynn. Thanks to Martin Regg Cohn for your expert moderation on multiple platforms and devices. Thanks to Brian Bose from TMU AV. And thanks to all the team at the dais, led by our communications and events liaison, the indomitable Catherine Embergi. Watch for Martin's piece about this event in the Toronto Star. Please subscribe. And please follow us at dais.ca and mediatechdemocracy.com for the latest on this pressing issue. These are issues which both the dais and the Center for Media and Technology and Democracy are going to be actively involved in the coming while, and the broader conversation around having safe and healthy online spaces. Thank you so much.
Thank you.